The sun was barely peeking over the Montana hills when Keanu Reeves stepped onto the porch of his remote ranch. Dressed in a worn flannel shirt and faded jeans, he looked like any other man living a quiet life in the countryside. But the sharp glint in his eyes, the disciplined movements of his body, and the way he scanned his surroundings before taking another step betrayed his past. Keanu had been a Navy SEAL, one of the best. He had fought in places most people couldn't even locate on a map, survived situations that should have killed him, and done things he didn't care to remember. But that was another life, one he had left behind years ago. Now, his world consisted of acres of land, the rhythmic sound of the wind through the trees, and the steady companionship of Titan, his loyal Belgian Malinois. Titan trotted up beside him, his powerful body moving with precision. The dog had been with Keanu since the day he left the military, a trained canine who had once been part of the same elite unit. Now, he was more than just a working dog, he was family. Keanu took a sip of his morning coffee, gazing out at the vast land stretching before him. The world here was simple. Wake up, tend to the horses, check the fences, take Titan for a run, and then maybe, just maybe, allow himself to enjoy the silence. But that morning, the silence felt different. Off. Titan's ears perked up. His posture stiffened, eyes locked onto the tree line in the distance. Keanu followed his gaze, instincts kicking in before his mind could process the situation. Something was watching them. He placed his coffee down and moved toward his truck, where he kept his rifle secured. His senses were sharp as ever, honed by years of training and experience. But before he could take another step, his phone buzzed in his pocket. Brian Reeves, his younger brother. Keanu hesitated for a moment before answering. Brian was a detective in Helena, and he never called this early unless it was serious. "Talk to me," Keanu said. "You need to come into town." Brian's voice was tense. "Something's happening. Something big." Keanu exhaled, glancing back at Titan, who was still locked onto the distant trees. The peaceful life he had built was about to crumble. He could feel it, and he wasn't ready to let it go without a fight. Keanu slid his phone back into his pocket and whistled for Titan. The dog obeyed instantly, falling into step beside him as they made their way to the truck. The old Ford rumbled to life, and Keanu guided it down the dirt road that led into town, his mind already piecing together possibilities. Brian wouldn't call him unless it was something serious, and if it was bad enough for his brother to reach out, then it was definitely worse than it seemed. The drive into Elk Valley took about 15 minutes. It was the kind of town where everyone knew everyone, where people still waved at passing cars and stopped to chat at the general store. But today, there was something different in the air. As Keanu pulled up outside Margaret's Diner, the unofficial meeting place of the town, he noticed unfamiliar vehicles lining the street. Black SUVs, tinted windows, not the kind of cars that belonged in a quiet place like this. Titan growled low, sensing the unease that Keanu already felt in his gut. He stepped out of the truck, scanning the street. Locals were gathered in small clusters, whispering among themselves. Their faces were tight with concern, their eyes darting toward the outsiders who were lingering near the vehicles. Keanu walked into the diner, and the second he stepped inside, he spotted Brian sitting in a booth near the back. His younger brother looked tense, his jaw tight, his fingers drumming impatiently on the table. Keanu slid into the seat across from him. "Talk." Brian didn't waste time. "They're here for the land." Keanu frowned. "Who? La Frontera," Brian said, lowering his voice. "Cartel from Mexico. They've been expanding north, looking for quiet towns with weak law enforcement. Elk Valley is perfect for them. Middle of nowhere, easy to smuggle product through. And the sheriff," he nodded towards Sheriff Carter, who was sitting at the counter, deliberately avoiding eye contact, "is already in their pocket." Keanu leaned back, his eyes narrowing. "And you're just telling me this now?" Brian exhaled sharply. "I didn't think it would get this far." But then they started buying up land, pressuring people to sell. Some folks took the money, others didn't. He glanced toward the front of the diner, where an elderly man sat alone, staring into his coffee. "Mr. Dawson's farm burned down last night. Cause? Electrical fire, according to the sheriff. But Dawson's been refusing to sell for months." Keanu clenched his jaw. He'd spent years trying to escape violence, to leave behind the kind of world where men like the cartel operated freely. But now that world had followed him here, and he knew exactly what men like them were capable of. Keanu took a slow breath, his fingers tapping against the table as he processed Brian's words. He'd seen this before, small towns swallowed up by something bigger, something darker. The people here were hardworking, good-hearted, but they weren't fighters, and that made them easy targets. He glanced towards Sheriff Carter, noting the way the man avoided looking in his direction. That confirmed everything. The law wouldn't protect this town. If anything, it was already compromised. Brian lowered his voice even more. They're making a move on Creek Pass. It's the perfect route for them, isolated, barely patrolled, direct access to the highways. If they control it, they control everything coming through this part of the state. Keanu exhaled through his nose, eyes flicking to Titan, who was watching the door like a sentry. The dog could sense the tension in the air, just like Keanu could. Who else knows? Brian hesitated. Margaret, Dawson, a few others. But most people are scared. And the ones who aren't, they're already getting accidents like Dawson. Keanu clenched his jaw. Who's running things? Brian's lips pressed into a thin line. A man named Santiago Cortez. Ex-military, smart, disciplined. Not your typical cartel thug. He's been methodical, moving slow, earning trust before tightening the noose. Keanu had heard the name before. Santiago was known for being more than just a businessman, he was a strategist. That made him dangerous. The bell above the diner door chimed, and Keanu instinctively shifted his posture, angling himself to see without being obvious. 3 men walked in. They were dressed casually, jeans, button-ups, but everything about them screamed wrong. Their builds, their movements, the way their eyes scanned the room. Predators. Brian tensed but didn't react otherwise. Keanu understood why. They were being watched. The last thing they needed was to show their hand too soon. The taller of the 3 men, a guy with a buzz cut and a scar running down his cheek, walked up to the counter and flashed a grin at Margaret. Coffee. Black. Margaret poured the coffee, her hands steady, but Keanu caught the flicker of unease in her eyes. The other 2 men took a table near the entrance, their chairs positioned so they could see everyone inside. Keanu kept his expression neutral, but his mind was already working. These weren't just scouts. They were enforcers, here to remind the town who was in charge. Brian leaned forward slightly. They've been here 3 times this week. Keanu's lips barely moved. And how many times have they left disappointed? Brian's mouth twitched. Every time. Keanu's eyes darkened. Then it's only a matter of time before they stop asking and start taking. Titan let out a quiet growl, low enough that only Keanu could hear. He reached under the table, running his fingers over the dog's head. It had already begun. Keanu left the diner without another word, Titan walking in perfect sync beside him. The 3 cartel men watched him go, but none of them spoke. They didn't need to. Their presence alone was a message. We own this town. Get in our way, and you'll regret it. Keanu had heard it all before. He had seen it before, and he knew exactly how it would end. As he pulled out of the parking lot, he spotted Brian through the rearview mirror, still sitting in the booth, pretending not to be tense. His brother was doing what he could to fight back, but he was alone. And in a town like this, alone meant dead. Keanu tightened his grip on the steering wheel. He had spent years trying to outrun violence, to live a life that didn't involve guns, blood, and death. But now, violence had found him again. And this time, it wasn't going to let him walk away. The dirt road leading back to his ranch stretched out ahead, the late afternoon sun casting long shadows across the landscape. Titan, still alert from the encounter in town, sat rigid in the passenger seat, ears pricked forward. He felt it too. The shift in the air. The weight of something unseen pressing down on them. When Keanu turned onto his property, he immediately noticed something was wrong. The horses in the pasture were restless, their movements uneasy. The wind carried a scent he couldn't quite place, but it was foreign. Out of place. He slowed the truck to a crawl, his trained eyes scanning the landscape. Nothing seemed out of order, but his instincts screamed otherwise. Titan let out a low growl. Keanu killed the engine. Silence settled over the land. Then movement. A shadow near the tree line. Too large to be a coyote, too fluid to be a deer. Keanu's pulse quickened. He reached for the rifle mounted behind his seat, his body moving on instinct. He stepped out of the truck, Titan right beside him, their movements slow, deliberate. The shadow didn't disappear. It stood there, watching. Keanu raised the rifle, his finger resting lightly on the trigger. "Come out." For a moment, nothing happened. Then, the figure took a step forward. The light caught it just right, and Keanu's breath caught in his throat. It wasn't a man. It was a dog. A large Belgian Malinois, its coat dark and matted, its frame lean but powerful. Its ears were sharp, its stance unwavering, and its eyes locked onto Keanu's with something between recognition and disbelief. Keanu felt his grip tighten on the rifle. His mind was playing tricks on him. It had to be, because the dog standing before him was impossible. The dog standing before him was Ghost, the dog he had lost 4 years ago. Keanu's breath was steady, but his heart pounded against his ribs. He blinked, willing the vision to disappear, but the dog remained, standing like a sentinel at the edge of the trees. It was impossible. Ghost had died 4 years ago, lost in the chaos of a mission gone wrong. He had seen the explosion, heard the desperate bark before the comms went silent. They had searched for hours, combing through the debris, but Ghost was gone. And yet, here he was, staring at Keanu with those same fierce, intelligent eyes. Titan stood frozen beside him, muscles coiled, and certain of what to make of the intruder. The two dogs locked eyes, a silent standoff stretching between them. Ghost didn't move, didn't flinch, just observed, as if waiting for something. Keanu lowered his rifle slowly, his fingers flexing against the barrel. Ghost. His own voice sounded foreign to him. The name tasted strange after all these years, as if speaking it might shatter the illusion. Ghost's ears twitched, his head tilting slightly at the sound of his name, but he remained where he was. His body bore the marks of survival, old scars crisscrossed his flanks, and his coat was unkempt, as if he had been living wild. But there was no mistaking him. The same notched ear, the same scar just above his left eye, the same unwavering focus that had once made him the best war dog Keanu had ever seen. Titan took a slow step forward, testing, waiting for a reaction. Ghost remained still, but his eyes flicked to Titan, assessing, measuring. Then, without a sound, he took a step closer. Keanu felt his throat tighten. This wasn't a ghost. This wasn't a hallucination. This was real. Ghost was alive. But how? Keanu lowered himself to a crouch, his movements careful, controlled. He extended a hand, palm facing up, the way he used to when calling Ghost in the field. For a moment, the dog hesitated. Then, as if something inside him finally clicked into place, he moved. Slow at first, then faster, until he was right in front of Keanu, his nose brushing against his outstretched hand. The touch sent a shock through Keanu's system. His fingers curled into the thick fur, and Ghost let out a low, familiar huff, pressing his head against Keanu's palm, the same way he always had after a long mission. Keanu closed his eyes for half a second, grounding himself in the impossible reality before him. When he opened them again, Ghost was still there. The past had just walked out of the trees and into his present. And whatever had brought him back, it wasn't over yet. Titan let out a sharp bark, pulling Keanu back to the present. The Malinois turned toward the tree line, ears pinned forward, body tense. Ghost did the same. And that's when Keanu realized they weren't alone. Keanu's grip tightened around his rifle as his instincts kicked into overdrive. Titan and Ghost were both locked onto something beyond the tree line, their bodies rigid, muscles coiled. Whatever was out there wasn't just passing through. It was watching, assessing. The hairs on the back of Keanu's neck rose. Years of combat had trained him to recognize when he was being hunted. And right now, he was. The air was thick with silence, the kind that came before a storm. Keanu shifted his stance, angling himself slightly to the side to minimize his silhouette. His eyes scanned the dense foliage, searching for movement, a shadow, a glint of metal, anything that didn't belong. Nothing. But that didn't mean no one was there. Titan let out a soft growl, low and warning. Ghost remained eerily silent, but his posture spoke volumes. He had been through hell, and whatever had kept him alive all these years had made him sharper, meaner, more like a ghost than ever. Then, a whisper of movement, a subtle shift in the underbrush. Keanu exhaled slowly, steadying his breath, his pulse no longer racing but measured, controlled. If they were going to make a move, it would be now. He took a careful step forward, just enough to let them know he wasn't afraid. The shadows held their breath. Then, just as quickly as the presence had appeared, it was gone. The air lightened, the tension easing just a fraction, but Keanu didn't relax. He knew better. This wasn't over. Ghost turned to him, eyes sharp, questioning. Keanu met his gaze, understanding passing between them. Someone had been watching, and Ghost had led them right to it. Maybe that was the point. Maybe Ghost hadn't just wandered back home, maybe he had been sent. Keanu lowered his rifle but didn't put it away. He needed answers, and he wasn't going to find them standing in the middle of his property waiting for the next move. He whistled once, a sharp command. Titan immediately fell into step beside him. Ghost hesitated, just for a second, before following. Keanu noted the pause but didn't push. Ghost had been on his own for too long. Trust would take time. Back at the house, Keanu locked the doors out of habit, even though he knew locks wouldn't stop the kind of people who had just been watching him. He grabbed a bottle of water from the counter, took a long drink, then turned back to Ghost. The dog was sitting near the doorway, watching him with unsettling intensity. "How the hell are you still alive?" Keanu muttered, running a hand through his hair. Ghost didn't answer, of course. But Keanu swore. For just a moment, the dog's expression changed, as if he understood the question. As if he knew the answer. And if that was true, then Keanu had a feeling he wasn't going to like what came next. Keanu barely slept that night. He sat at the kitchen table, a half-empty cup of coffee growing cold beside him, his eyes locked on Ghost. The dog hadn't moved much, sitting near the door like a sentry, ears constantly shifting, body tense. Titan had curled up near Keanu's feet, but even he wasn't fully at ease. They could all feel it, the shift in the air. Something was coming. At dawn, Keanu was already outside checking the perimeter. The wind carried the scent of pine and damp earth, but nothing out of the ordinary. Ghost followed him, moving like a shadow, his paws barely making a sound on the ground. Titan stayed close as well, but there was a hesitation in his steps, as if he wasn't sure what to make of Ghost yet. Keanu reached the main gate and stopped. The lock was snapped clean off, the chain cut. Someone had been here. Someone had come onto his land. His jaw tightened. He crouched down, examining the ground. Tracked several pairs of boots, heavy, military grade. They hadn't even tried to cover their presence. This wasn't just some random trespasser. It was a message. Keanu pulled his phone from his pocket and dialed Brian. His brother picked up on the second ring. "You were right," Keanu said, his voice low. "They're making a move." Brian cursed under his breath. "How bad?" "Tracks on my land. Gate was cut." "That's bold. They're testing me." Keanu stood, scanning the trees again. He could feel the weight of unseen eyes. "Or trying to send a message, then send one back," Brian said. Keanu almost smiled. That was the difference between them. Brian played by the rules. Keanu had spent a lifetime breaking them. "I will," Keanu muttered, before hanging up. He turned to Ghost, who was still watching the gate. The dog had already survived something Keanu couldn't yet understand, and now he was back, right when Keanu needed him most. Coincidence? He didn't believe in those. Ghost's ears flicked. Titan's head lifted. Then, a sound, engines. Keanu's muscles coiled. A black SUV rolled up the dirt road, moving slow, deliberate. It stopped just outside the gate. The driver's side door opened, and a man stepped out. He was tall, lean, wearing an expensive suit that looked out of place in a town like this. Santiago Cortez. Keanu exhaled through his nose. He had seen men like this before, calm, composed, but cold with violence just beneath the surface. Santiago smiled. "Mr. Reeves," he said smoothly, "we should talk." Keanu didn't move, didn't blink. His grip tightened on the rifle slung over his shoulder. "If you came to negotiate," he said, his voice like steel, "you wasted a trip." Santiago's smile didn't falter, but his eyes darkened slightly, as if he had expected Keanu's response but was still disappointed by it. He took a slow step forward, his polished shoes crunching lightly against the gravel. Behind him, the SUV's windows remained tinted, concealing whoever was inside. Keanu knew better than to assume he was alone. Men like Santiago never traveled without backup. "I admire men like you," Santiago said, his voice smooth, calculated. "Men who build things with their hands, who take pride in their work. You remind me of my father." He gestured vaguely toward the ranch. "A place like this. It takes discipline." Strength. Keanu remained silent. He had seen this tactic before: false camaraderie. Flattery meant to lower defenses. It wasn't going to work. Santiago sighed, as if Keanu's lack of response personally pained him. Let's not waste each other's time, Mr. Reeves. You know why I'm here. Creek Pass is valuable, and you own one of the most important pieces of it. He gestured toward the gate. I'd like to make you an offer. Keanu finally spoke. Not for sale. Santiago chuckled, shaking his head. Everything is for sale, Mr. Reeves. It's just a matter of finding the right price. He reached into his jacket not for a gun, but for a neatly folded piece of paper. He held it out. This is more money than you'll ever need. More than this ranch is worth. Take it. Walk away. Enjoy the rest of your life somewhere warm. Keanu didn't even glance at the paper. He kept his eyes locked on Santiago. I told you, he said evenly. You wasted a trip. Santiago exhaled through his nose, the smile fading completely. He studied Keanu for a long moment, then slowly tucked the offer back into his jacket. His disappointment was evident, but there was something else beneath it: amusement, as if he had just confirmed something he already suspected. You're a man of principle, Santiago said, stepping back toward his SUV. I respect that, truly. He opened the door, pausing before getting in. But principles won't protect you, Mr. Reeves. They won't protect your land, or the people around you. His eyes flicked toward Ghost and Titan, both dogs standing rigid and moving. Sooner or later, you'll see that. He climbed into the SUV, and the vehicle pulled away, kicking up dust as it disappeared down the road. Keanu didn't move, didn't relax. The air was still thick with tension, even after the SUV was gone. Ghost let out a low growl, his eyes locked on the empty road. Titan mirrored him. Keanu exhaled slowly. This wasn't a warning. This was a declaration. Santiago had just marked him as a problem. And problems like him. The cartel only handled them one way. Keanu watched the dust settle, his mind already working through the implications of what had just happened. Santiago hadn't come here expecting to negotiate. He had come to make an assessment, to look Keanu in the eye and decide if he was a threat. And based on the way he left, it was clear he had reached his decision. Keanu wasn't an obstacle to be reasoned with. He was a problem to be eliminated. He turned back toward the house, his steps measured, controlled. Titan and Ghost followed, both dogs sensing the shift in his energy. He had spent years trying to leave this life behind, but fate had a cruel sense of humor. The past never stayed buried. It always found a way back. Inside, he grabbed his phone and dialed Brian. His brother answered immediately. Tell me you didn't do anything stupid, Brian said instead of a greeting. Keanu ignored him. Santiago was just here. Silence. Then, a sharp breath. Shit. He made an offer. I declined. Of course you did. Brian's voice was tight. Which means things are about to get worse. Keanu already knew that. How much time do I have? Brian hesitated. Depends on how much he wants your land. If it's critical to their operation, I'd say a few days, maybe less. If it's just another piece on the board, he might take his time. Either way, you need to be ready. Keanu glanced at Ghost, who was still watching the door like he expected someone to walk through it at any second. I'm always ready, Brian sighed. Look, I know you can handle yourself, but this isn't a war zone. You start something, and innocent people are going to get caught in the crossfire. Keanu's grip tightened on the phone. That's why I'm not letting them make the first move. Damn it, Keanu. He ended the call. He didn't have time for arguments. Brian would try to stop him, but Keanu knew the truth. The only way to win a fight like this was to end it before it began. He opened the gun safe in the corner of the room. Inside were the remnants of a life he had sworn to leave behind: handguns, rifles, tactical gear, tools of war. He ran his fingers over the metal, feeling the weight of old ghosts pressing down on him. Titan sat beside him, watching in silence. Ghost lingered near the door, still as a statue. Keanu exhaled slowly. This wasn't just about him anymore. The cartel had made a mistake. They had come onto his land, threatened his home. Now, it was his turn. And when the time came, he wouldn't miss. The night was silent. Keanu stood on the porch, his rifle resting lightly in his hands, his breath steady despite the storm building inside him. Ghost and Titan flanked him, both dogs locked in a state of heightened awareness, their ears twitching at every distant sound. He had reinforced the property's perimeter, set up motion sensors, and checked every line of sight from his vantage points. It wouldn't be enough to stop them, but it would give him the edge. And when the time came, an edge was all he needed. His phone buzzed in his pocket. "Brian," Keanu answered but didn't speak. "They're coming," Brian said, his voice grim. "Multiple vehicles. Armed. You need to get out of there." Keanu's grip tightened around the rifle. "Not happening. Damn it, Keanu. Santiago isn't playing around. You can't take them all." Keanu's eyes swept across the dark landscape, his pulse slow, controlled. "I don't need to take them all. Just enough." There was silence on the other end. Then, Brian sighed. "You always were a stubborn bastard. I'll do what I can from my end, but don't expect backup anytime soon." Keanu ended the call. He hadn't been expecting backup. He never did. Then, he heard it. Engines. Multiple. The sound of tires crunching against gravel filled the night air, distant headlights cutting through the darkness like hungry eyes. Keanu inhaled deeply, feeling the old instincts settle into place. His world narrowed, his thoughts sharpened. This wasn't a ranch anymore. It was a battlefield. Titan let out a deep growl, his body lowering in anticipation. Ghost remained still, but Keanu could see at the controlled tension, cold readiness. He had done this before. The first SUV rolled to a stop just outside the property line. Then another. Then a third. The headlights went dark. Silence. A test. They were waiting, seeing if he would react first. Keanu didn't move. A door opened. A figure stepped out, backlit by the dim glow of a cigarette. A voice carried across the open space, smooth, confident. "Mr. Reeves. Santiago. Last chance." Keanu exhaled through his nose, adjusting his grip on the rifle. "No," he said simply. Santiago sighed. "I was hoping you'd say that." Then, he snapped his fingers. Gunfire erupted. Keanu dropped to a knee, his rifle already shouldered. The first shot was his. And when Keanu Reeves fired, he never missed. The first shot tore through the night, striking the nearest gunman square in the chest before he even had a chance to react. Chaos erupted instantly. Muzzle flashes lit up the darkness as Santiago's men opened fire, spraying bullets toward the house. But Keanu was already moving. He ducked behind the thick wooden support beam of the porch, returning fire with precise, controlled bursts. He wasn't just shooting to keep them back, he was eliminating threats. One by one, Titan lunged forward, moving low through the tall grass, circling wide toward the nearest SUV. Ghost, however, didn't wait. The dog was a blur of muscle and speed, closing the distance between him and the nearest attacker in seconds. A scream cut through the gunfire as Ghost hit his target, his powerful jaws clamping onto the man's arm, dragging him down with brutal efficiency. Keanu didn't hesitate. He put a bullet in the second man who turned to help his fallen ally. More gunmen spilled out of the vehicles, fanning out in a loose semicircle. They thought they had the numbers, but they had no idea what they were up against. Keanu dropped another one before shifting positions, using the terrain to his advantage. He had chosen this land for a reason. It was defendable. And he had spent years preparing for something exactly like this. A bullet splintered the wooden beam beside him, sending shards of wood across his cheek. Keanu ignored the sting, rolling to his right, snapping off another shot. The man trying to flank him dropped, his rifle clattering against the dirt. Titan reached the first SUV, leaping onto the hood with practiced agility before launching himself into the open driver's side window. A guttural scream followed, then the unmistakable sound of a body being slammed against the door. Keanu had trained Titan well. Ghost, meanwhile, was relentless. He weaved through the chaos, striking like a phantom, vanishing before bullets could find him. He had survived 4 years in the wilderness for a reason. He was a weapon. Then, Keanu spotted him. Santiago. The cartel leader stood near the second SUV, watching the battle unfold with an expression of mild interest. He wasn't worried. Not yet. Keanu's jaw tightened. That would change soon enough. He adjusted his aim, centering the scope's reticle on Santiago's chest. One shot. That's all it would take to end this. He exhaled slowly, steadying his grip. And then movement. A figure rushed into his line of fire. A hostage. No, not a hostage. Brian. Keanu's focus shattered for a split second. And in that moment, everything went to hell. Keanu's finger hovered over the trigger, but he couldn't take the shot. Brian was being dragged forward, a pistol pressed against his temple, his hands zip-tied behind his back. Santiago stood beside him, calm as ever, his expression unreadable. The remaining gunmen formed a loose perimeter on them, their weapons trained on Keanu's position. The gunfire had stopped, replaced by the eerie silence of a battlefield caught in a temporary ceasefire. Ghost and Titan were still prowling in the shadows, but they had stopped attacking, sensing the shift in the fight. Keanu clenched his jaw, his mind racing. He had been ready for an ambush, ready for a siege, but he hadn't expected this. Santiago's voice carried across the space between them. "Put the gun down, Mr. Reeves." Keanu didn't move, didn't blink. Santiago pressed the barrel of his pistol harder against Brian's skull. "Or I put a bullet in your brother." Brian's eyes met Keanu's, steady despite the situation. "Don't do it," he said. "You know how this ends." Keanu knew exactly how this ended. He also knew Santiago was too smart to keep his word. If Keanu surrendered, they would both be dead within the hour. But if he made a move, Brian would die first. A flicker of movement caught his eye. Ghost was inching forward, silent as death, positioning himself behind one of the cartel's gunmen. Titan was doing the same on the opposite side. They were waiting for his signal. Keanu's pulse slowed. He shifted his weight slightly, just enough for Ghost to see. A tiny movement. Now, Ghost struck first, launching himself at the nearest gunman's throat. The man barely had time to scream before he hit the ground, blood spraying into the dirt. Titan took down the second one before anyone could react. In that split second of chaos, Keanu moved. His rifle snapped up. One shot. The man holding Brian dropped. Brian hit the dirt, rolling away as Keanu shifted aim. Second shot. The nearest gunman went down. Santiago was already moving, pulling his pistol toward Keanu. Too slow. Keanu fired. The bullet slammed into Santiago's shoulder, spinning him back against the SUV. He gritted his teeth, pressing a hand to the wound, eyes flashing with something between pain and fury. Keanu took a step forward, lining up the final shot. But Santiago just smiled. "See you soon, Mr. Reeves," he muttered. Then, in one fluid motion, he pulled a smoke grenade from his jacket, yanked the pin, and dropped it. Thick, choking smoke exploded outward. Keanu fired, but it was too late. Santiago was gone. The cartel was broken. But the war had just begun. The smoke lingered long after the gunfire had stopped, curling through the cold night air like the ghost of a battle that had finally ended. Keanu stood motionless, his rifle still raised, his breathing steady but controlled. Titan and Ghost were at his sides, their bodies tense, waiting for the next fight. But there was no more fight left, not tonight. Brian groaned as he pushed himself up from the dirt, rubbing his wrists where the zip ties had cut into his skin. "You always did have a way of making things complicated," he muttered. Keanu lowered his rifle, eyes scanning the area. Several of Santiago's men lay sprawled across the ground, and moving. The others had fled the moment their leader disappeared into the smoke, leaving behind only their dead. The cartel hadn't expected this kind of resistance. And now, they were shattered. But Keanu knew better than to believe it was over. Santiago wasn't dead. And a man like him, he wouldn't stay in the shadows for long. Brian dusted himself off and turned to Keanu. "We need to finish this. If Santiago's still out there, he'll regroup. Come back stronger." Keanu exhaled through his nose. "I know." A distant howl echoed through the mountains. Ghost's ears perked, his body going rigid. He recognized the sound. A warning. Keanu followed Ghost's gaze toward the tree line, his gut tightening. Somewhere in the darkness, someone was still watching. Maybe Santiago. Maybe another threat. Or maybe just the past, refusing to let go. He tightened his grip on his rifle. "Then we get ready." Brian let out a short laugh, shaking his head. "You're really not gonna walk away from this, are you?" Keanu's eyes stayed locked on the trees. "I walked away once. Look where it got me." Silence stretched between them. Brian sighed. "All right," he said, rubbing a hand over his face. "Then let's finish it." Keanu finally turned toward him. "Not yet." Brian frowned. "What do you mean, not yet?" Keanu glanced at Ghost, then at Titan. Both dogs were watching him, waiting. "We're not just fighting a man," Keanu said. "We're fighting a system. A network. If we go after Santiago now, we might take him out, but another one will take his place. He shook his head. We need to cut the head off the snake. Permanently. Brian studied him for a long moment, then nodded. Then we do it right. Keanu turned back to the ranch, the weight of the night settling onto his shoulders. The war wasn't over, but he was going to end it. On his terms. The following days were spent preparing. Keanu reinforced the perimeter, set new traps, and mapped out every possible entry point onto his land. Brian worked on gathering intel, reaching out to his contacts to track Santiago's movements. The cartel was fractured, but they weren't gone. And Santiago? He was too proud, too ruthless to let this go unanswered. He would come back. The only question was when. Keanu wasn't planning to wait for that answer. He was going to take the fight to Santiago before the cartel had a chance to regroup. But that meant knowing exactly where to hit them. And for that, they needed help. Brian made the call. An old contact, someone who had been watching Santiago's operations for years. The meeting was set at an abandoned gas station just outside town. Keanu went alone, Ghost and Titan riding with him in the truck. The air was thick with tension as he pulled up, his grip firm on the wheel. He had spent most of his life dealing with men like Santiago, predators who thrived on fear. The only way to stop them was to be more ruthless than they were. The agent was waiting for him, a middle-aged man with sharp eyes and a tired face. He introduced himself as Agent Collins. "You made a hell of a mess," Collins said, nodding toward Keanu. "Cartel's in chaos. Santiago's men are scrambling. But you didn't finish the job." Keanu's expression didn't change. "Not yet." Collins smirked. "Good. Because we want him gone too." He pulled out a folder, tossing it onto the hood of Keanu's truck. Inside were satellite images, surveillance reports, maps of known cartel hideouts. One location was circled in red. "He's here," Collins said. "A safe house outside the city. Small team, but heavily armed. You go in loud, you won't make it out." Keanu studied the map. "I don't go in loud. I go in smart." Collins chuckled. "That's why you're still alive." Keanu closed the folder. He already had a plan forming in his mind. A way to end this, permanently. No more warnings. No more games. Santiago had come onto his land, tried to take what was his. Now, Keanu was going to take everything from him. Collins glanced at the two dogs in the truck. They ready for another fight? Keanu looked at Ghost and Titan. They didn't need words to answer. They were always ready. Collins nodded. "Then let's end this." Keanu started the truck, his gaze locked on the road ahead. The war wasn't over. But by the time this was done, Santiago wouldn't just be running. He'd be buried. Night fell as Keanu made his final preparations. Every weapon was checked, every route memorized. The plan was simple: get in, eliminate Santiago, and get out before the rest of the cartel even knew what happened. Brian had pulled some strings to ensure law enforcement stayed clear of the area, and Collins had provided schematics of the safe house. It wasn't a fortress, but it was guarded well enough that a frontal assault would be suicide. Good thing Keanu never played by the rules. Ghost and Titan sat beside him as he crouched on a ridge overlooking the compound. Through his scope, he counted 6 guards outside, armed, but relaxed. They weren't expecting an attack. Not yet. Keanu exhaled slowly, steadied his aim, and fired. The first guard dropped instantly, a silent kill. The second barely had time to register before Keanu put a bullet through his chest. The others panicked, scrambling for cover. Too late. Keanu was already moving. He sprinted down the slope, heaping low, Ghost and Titan flanking him like shadows. A third guard turned the corner, rifle raised. Ghost struck first, teeth sinking into the man's wrist, dragging him down. Keanu put him down with a single shot and kept going. Inside the house, alarms blared. They knew. Good. Let them come. Keanu kicked open the door, sweeping through the entryway, taking down 2 more men before they could react. Bullets ripped through the walls, but he was already moving, using the darkness to his advantage. Then a voice. "Mr. Reeves," Santiago called out from somewhere deeper inside. "You should have taken my offer." Keanu didn't reply. He kept moving. A hallway. A door slightly ajar. He pushed in, gun raised. Santiago stood on the other side, pistol aimed. Too slow. Keanu fired first, a clean shot to the shoulder, forcing the cartel leader to drop his weapon. Santiago stumbled, blood seeping through his expensive suit. Keanu stepped forward, pressing his gun to Santiago's forehead. "This ends here." Santiago smiled despite the pain. "You kill me, someone takes my place. You know that?" Keanu's grip tightened. "Not if I kill them all." He pulled the trigger. Santiago's body crumpled. Silence filled the room. Outside, the last of his men lay dead. The war was over. Keanu exhaled, lowering his weapon. Ghost and Titan stood at his side, their work done. It was finally over. As dawn broke, Keanu stood outside the burning ruins of the safe house. Brian arrived, shaking his head at the destruction. "So what now?" Keanu watched the sun rise. "A new beginning." Titan barked once. Ghost stood tall. Keanu smirked. "Now, we go home." And for the first time in years, he finally meant it.